Today we're going to be looking at 5 underrated Hammer horror films. If you're not familiar with the work of Hammer, in the late 1950s, the 60s and 70s, Hammer were a really important British studio which gained global success by making the Dracula, Frankenstein and Mummy series of films, with a selection of others as well. They actually got a lot of recognition in Britain just before that by an adaptation of Nigel Kneale's excellent The Quatermass Experiment, but we're not going to focus too much on some of the mainstream or the kind of canon Hammer that people are most familiar with today. We're going to focus on 5 underrated classics. Hammer started at Bray Studios in the south of England and eventually moved to Elstree for budgetary reasons. It was usually the same crew that would work on throughout the most of the films, particularly earlier in the cycle. What's interesting toward the later era of Hammer in the early 1970s, you get some new, fresh talent brought in, and overall the kind of quality of the films across the board does go down slightly. You can see a kind of a bit more variety. They're trying to mix up the formula and do some interesting things with it, which is where we get 4 of our 5 interesting films for today. Our first film is the 1972 Brian Clemens film, Captain Kronos, a Vampire Hunter. Horst Janssen plays Captain Kronos. He is dubbed in the film. He's actually a Danish actor. Travels the countryside with his friend Professor Grost hunting vampires, and along the way they come along the beautiful Caroline Munro, who's been imprisoned for dancing on a Sunday. You got to remember, Britain was a much more religious country back then. Very, very British attitude to this film, and you get an interesting turn by one of Britain's greatest character actors, Ian Hendry, who's fantastic in a role. He turns up for just a couple of scenes about a third of the way through. He was pretty much appearing for beer money. He was a notorious alcoholic despite being a fantastic actor. Some of his notable appearances are in the film Get Carter as the chauffeur. He appears in a really underrated Sean Connery movie directed by Sidney Lumet called The Hill, which is a prison of war drama. He has some notable exchanges with Captain Kronos and he's fantastic in, and some really interesting dialogue. And Captain Kronos goes on an adventure to find out why some people have been appearing in public looking noticeably aged after some nasty bites on the neck. The ending's kind of strange, it's left to be a bit ambiguous, but it was originally going to be part of a series of films, but it didn't do too well at the box office. One of the most thrilling aspects about the film is the excellent theme tune. I think it would have been a great theme tune to a series. It reminds me a bit of the Avengers in a way. And I think the series would have been an excellent vehicle for Caroline Munro. She's considered as one of the greatest Hammer horror, scream queens, but she only appeared in about 1 or 2 of the films. One of them might appear a bit later on in the list. Our next film is Twins of Evil from 1971, directed by John Ho. Now this is quite an important film for Hammer in that it shows that the tides are very much changing, so the films start to become a bit more sexualized in a way, and we can spot this because it starred the Collinson twins, who were famous Playboy playmates. However, there is some terrific acting performances in there. First of all, there's Peter Cushing as this great evangelical character, very much like the Vincent Price role in Witchfinder General, which is another great film worth checking out. You also get Kathleen Byron, who is in an excellent film, a British classic called Black Narcissus, from the 1940s, playing Sister Ruth in that original film. Absolutely terrifying in that role. The last 10 minutes of Black Narcissus scared me to death when I was a kid. She's great in this as well. You also get an appearance from David Warbeck as well, who appeared in Lucio Fulci's seminal zombie classic The Beyond. He's quite young in this. An interesting bit of trivia, he was briefly considered for the role of James Bond during the Roger Moore era, but apparently the rumour is that he found his acting style a bit too stiff. But he's on good form here, and he's excellent in The Beyond. It's a very atmospheric film. It's very typical of the later Hammer series. There's quite a bit of gore in there as well. There's a bit of nudity in there for those that like that sort of thing, and it's well worth checking out. The next film is Dracula AD 72 from 1972, directed by Alan Gibson, who'd worked on TV shows such as The Avengers, brings real life to the series. Now, before you scream at the monitor, the early Dracula films are absolutely fantastic, directed with real class by Terence Fisher. Also, Freddie Francis comes along in the middle of the cycle to bring some kind of like rich Eastman colours to things. And after all, Hammer were the first British studio to do horror films in colour. Why I love this film so much? Well, it's a hilarious misstep, but there's some really interesting performances in it. What they essentially do is they update the Dracula series into what was then the modern world. They have Dracula running around discos chasing after the likes of Stephanie Beacham and again our old friend Caroline Munro. It's a really interesting performance from Michael Kitchen, who'd later appear in the James Bond films as Bill Tanner, and also Christopher Neame, who has a brief appearance in the James Bond film A License to Kill. The plot is quite ludicrous, okay, and what's interesting is that the kind of swinging 60s vibe of kind of 66, 67 and Carnaby Street is dragged into the 1970s, and that scene was pretty much dead by then. Some really interesting fashion, some really interesting kind of chase sequences. Peter Cushing can barely run at one point, he looks absolutely exhausted. But he gives a stoic performance as always. Stephanie Beacham's quite good as Jessica Van Helsing, and there's not much to say about it really, other than the fact, please watch it, it's absolutely fantastic. Dracula would appear again, played by Christopher Lee, in the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which I found a bit disappointing, but it's got a good little end to it. And there's the truly awful, although some people seem to like it, The Curse of the Seven Golden Vampires, or The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, as it was known in some territories, where Dracula's played by another actor. Can't quite remember who it is, it might be John Forbes Robertson, something like that, and he's quite awful in it. Sorry if you are watching. The next film is Vampire Circus by Robert Young from 1971. One of the less known Hammer horror films. It doesn't have many famous leading actors in it, although fans of Doctor Who will recognise Lalla Ward, who makes a small appearance. He was famous for playing the second incarnation of Romana and was married to Tom Baker briefly in real life. This film, well, it's kind of a bit of a tour de force really. It's a typical kind of circus movie. There were a lot in the 1960s. There's Circus of Horrors, Circus of Fear, Circus of Terrors, many of which featured Christopher Lee for independent studios. And the plot, well, there's not a lot of it really. From memory, there's an aristocrat that's been murdering children from the village, and he ends up putting a curse on them when he's murdered by the townfolk in his castle, and for the next 15 years they have to fight off both the plague and vampirism, something like that. It's a bit left field, it's a bit out there, but it's quite fun, and it's worth for star spotting of people that appear in minor roles that will go on to star in TV, etc. Perhaps the jewel in the crown of underrated Hammer horror is The Damned by Joseph Losey from 1961. Had to throw one of the early ones in here. This is based on the book Children of the Light, and it's very much like the Midwich Cuckoos, or Village of the Damned as it's known in its cinematic form. This is a really interesting one. This is kind of like almost like a prototype Clockwork Orange in a way. Oliver Reed's part of a biker gang who's just terrifying some of the locals. Shirley Ann Field gives a pretty decent performance as his sister. Some people have often criticised her acting style. She makes an appearance in Peeping Tom, which is an excellent Michael Powell film from 1960. And the plot of the film is basically an American comes to town, he falls in love with a beautiful girl, but her brother's not too happy about it, so they decide to go on the run. Fortunately, the biker gang are chasing them whilst singing quite a decent little shanty, and basically they come across something hidden amongst the cliffs. And I don't want to give anything away because it's a nice surprise when you get there, but it is a bit like the Midwich Cuckoos. It's well worth checking out. It's very atmospheric, and it has a very bleak ending, which we don't traditionally associate with Hammer horror, but it's absolutely fantastic. For those of you that are more accustomed to mainstream Hammer horror, there are some more deep cuts that you might want to go into. So there's Rasputin the Mad Monk, which has a brilliant central performance by Christopher Lee. The Gorgon and the Reptile are well worth checking out as well. There's an interesting kind of postmodern experiment, Straight Until Morning, which I believe is based on a line from Peter Pan, which stars Rita Tushingham as a kind of socially aware horror film from the early 1970s. I think it was made about 71, 72. And there's also Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which is an interesting kind of social commentary on kind of attitudes to gender at that time, set in the Victorian days. Hope you have enjoyed this special on underrated Hammer horror films. Please, though, do not base your exploration purely on my list. Go out there and explore these excellent films. They're a key part of British culture and horror cinema. Feel free to make up your own list. It'd be fantastic to hear what some of them are. I'd like to thank you very much for watching and all the people that have commented on the previous videos. Thank you very much. Bye now.